There is a version of your life that feels just slightly out of reach. Not far, not impossible, just not quite here yet. You go through your days doing what needs to be done, but somewhere underneath it all, there was a quiet feeling that this is not quite it yet. It is not unhappiness exactly. It is more like a persistent sense that the real thing, the full thing, is still somewhere ahead. And so you wait. Not always consciously, not always with words, but you wait. You wait for the job that finally feels right, for the relationship that finally feels stable, for the version of yourself that finally feels ready. And while you wait, life continues. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, consistently, at its own pace. Most people who feel this way are not lazy, and they are not ungrateful. They are caught in a pattern that started long before they were aware of it. It often begins in childhood, in homes where love felt conditional, where approval had to be earned, where belonging required performing. When a child grows up learning that the present moment is something to survive rather than inhabit, the future becomes the only safe place to live. The mind learns early. The present is uncertain, but the future is a place where everything might finally be okay. And so the habit forms, not as a choice, but as a quiet architecture the mind builds around itself to feel safe. As the years pass, the future keeps moving, and the present keeps being something to get through rather than something to be in. There is always a threshold, a condition that has to be met before real living can begin. When I lose the weight, when I finish the degree, when I find the right person, when I finally feel ready. Each condition feels completely reasonable on its own, and that is exactly what makes the pattern so invisible for so long. You meet the condition, and instead of feeling arrived, you feel the relief last for a moment, and then the next condition appears. The goalpost was never meant to be reached, because reaching it was never really the point. The point was to stay in motion, to keep moving towards something, because stillness felt dangerous. Stillness meant having to feel what was actually there, and for many people, that had never been a safe thing to do. So the waiting becomes a kind of armor, a way of staying protected from the disappointment of fully committing to a life that might not turn out perfectly. If you never fully arrive, you never have to find out whether arriving would have been enough. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from living beside your own life instead of inside it. You are physically present, but emotionally on standby, available, functional, but not fully switched on. People around you may not even notice, because on the outside, everything looks completely fine. And because everything looks fine, no one asks. And because no one asks, the feeling stays unnamed for years. The unnamed feeling is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not interrupt your day with force. It arrives mostly in quiet moments, in the pause between one thing and the next, when there is nothing to distract you from it. It arrives on Sunday evenings, in the middle of something that should feel good, or just before you fall asleep. It is the feeling of watching your own life from a slight distance, like a film you are interested in, but not quite starring in. Psychologists sometimes call this depersonalization, but for most people, it never reaches a clinical level. It stays at the level of a low hum, a background frequency that colors everything without ever being loud enough to demand attention. It colors the way you make decisions, always with one eye on the future version of yourself who will finally have it together. It colors the way you experience good things. The happiness is real, but it arrives with an asterisk. Something good happens, and almost immediately a part of your mind whispers, "Yes, but this is not the real thing yet." That whisper is not pessimism, it is protection. a very old part of you keeping its guard up so you do not get hurt. It learned early that hope followed by disappointment was painful, and so it decided that partial hope was safer than full hope. Partial hope feels like wisdom. It feels like maturity, like you have simply learned how the world works. But there is a difference between wisdom and armor, and the body usually knows which one it is carrying. The armor is heavy, not because it is made of anything dramatic, but because it never comes off. And after long enough, you stop noticing the weight. It just becomes the way things feel, the baseline, the normal. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from never fully landing anywhere. It is the exhaustion of always preparing for a life you have not started yet, of rehearsing without ever performing. Some people spend enormous energy becoming the person they think they need to be before they allow themselves to actually live. The belief underneath all of this is quiet but powerful. The belief that you are not yet enough to deserve the full experience of being here. Not enough yet. Almost there. Just a little more, and then maybe. And then the bar moves again. This is one of the quietest forms of self-rejection. Not dramatic, not loud, just a consistent pattern of putting yourself last on the list of things that matter right now. And the waiting becomes a habit so ingrained that even when the conditions are finally met, something in you finds a reason to keep waiting. Because waiting has become an identity, not just a behavior, not just a habit, but a way of understanding who you are in relation to your own life. The waiter, and I say this with complete tenderness, has often confused waiting with humility, with patience, with being realistic. But there is a difference between patience and postponement, and the difference lives in whether the waiting is chosen or just happening to you. Chosen patience moves toward something. It has a relationship with the present, even while it looks ahead. Unconscious postponement avoids the present. It uses the future as a place to store everything that feels too uncertain to face right now. The box fills up over time, and eventually, you are carrying so much future that there is no room left in the present. This is when relationships begin to feel like waiting rooms. Pleasant enough, but not quite where the real conversation happens. Work becomes something to endure until the real career begins, even when the real career is already happening. Even the body gets the message and begins to hold itself in a kind of permanent pre-departure posture. There is always a suitcase somewhere, metaphorically packed, metaphorically by the door, just in case the real life calls and you need to leave quickly. And so a whole life can pass in this in-between state. Not miserable, not lost, just perpetually almost there. Not miserable enough to demand change, and not present enough to feel the fullness of what is already here. This is the cost that rarely gets named. Not suffering, but a quiet and consistent under-experience of your own existence. The question worth sitting with is not, why am I like this? But rather, when did I first decide that the present was not safe enough to live in fully? Because somewhere there was a first time, a moment, an environment, pattern of experiences that taught you the present moment was a place to move through, not to inhabit. Maybe it was a home where stability was always just around the corner, where things were going to be better soon, always soon. Maybe it was a childhood where your needs were met materially but not emotionally, where you were fed and clothed but not fully seen. Maybe it was simply a family where forward motion was the value, where achievement and becoming were praised and simply being was never quite enough. None of these origins are about blame. Understanding where a pattern began is not the same as deciding someone is responsible for it. Understanding is simply the first move, the moment the pattern stops being invisible and starts being something you can actually work with. And what you can work with, you can begin slowly, imperfectly, without any dramatic transformation, to change. The first thing that helps is deceptively simple. It is learning to notice when you have left the present. Not to force yourself back, not to criticize the drifting, just to notice it, the way you might notice the weather. The second thing that helps is learning to distinguish between planning and escaping, because they can look identical from the outside. Planning that is rooted in the present feels energizing. It extends from where you are, rather than replacing where you are. Escaping into the future feels relieving for a moment, and then leaves you slightly more depleted than before. The third thing that helps, and this one takes time, is building a relationship with the present that does not depend on it being perfect. Most people who wait for perfection before arriving have never been shown that imperfect presence is not a failure. It is simply presence. There is something that happens in the body when you stop waiting, a kind of settling, like a held breath finally released. The shoulders drop a little, the jaw unclenches. The hands, which have been holding on for so long, begin to open. This is not about becoming someone who never thinks about the future. It is about becoming someone who can also be here. It is about learning to let this, the ordinary, incomplete, imperfect this, count. To let this conversation count, this meal, this evening, this unremarkable Tuesday that will never come back. The real life you have been waiting for is not somewhere ahead. It has been accumulating quietly in exactly these moments. It has been in the small decisions, the quiet mornings, the moments you were present without realizing you were being present. And the strange and tender truth is, you were never really waiting for life to begin. You were already in it, every single day. The waiting was real. The years of almost were real. The longing for something more fully yours was real, and it was valid, and it made complete sense. And you were allowed to grieve a little for the time that passed while you were looking the other way. That grief is not weakness, it is honesty. Grief and guilt are different things, and it is worth knowing which one you are feeling when the weight of lost time arrives. Grief says, I wish that had been different. Guilt says, I should have known better. I should have done more. I should have been more aware. You could not have known what you did not yet know, and the pattern that kept you waiting was doing its best to protect you with the tools it had. Self-compassion in this context is not about excusing anything. It is about understanding that you were always doing the most reasonable thing available to you at the time. And now, with that understanding, something genuinely new becomes possible that was not possible before. The coat can come off. Not all at once, not forever, not without some days putting it back on, but it can come off. And on the days it goes back on, that is okay too, because now you know what it is, and knowing changes everything. This is what real change actually looks like. Not a single transformation, not a moment of sudden clarity that fixes everything. It looks like a small shift in attention, repeated slowly, imperfectly, across hundreds of ordinary days. It looks like catching yourself mid-weight, noticing the familiar pull towards somewhere else, and choosing just for this moment to stay. And then catching yourself again and again, without frustration, without making it mean something about your worth or your progress. The returning is the practice, not the arriving, not the staying perfectly, just the gentle and consistent act of coming back. You do not need to have it figured out. You do not need to be ready. You just need to be willing to be where you already are. The bench is still there, the one you have been sitting on while the world moved around you, and it will always be available on the hard days. But today, and perhaps tomorrow, and perhaps the day after, you are here,
in the only place where your actual life has ever taken place. There is a version of you that has been waiting for permission. Permission from circumstances, from other people, from some future feeling of readiness that keeps not arriving. The permission you have been waiting for was never going to come from anywhere outside of you. It was always yours to give.
Not permission to have everything figured out, permission to be present inside a life that is still unfinished, still imperfect, still genuinely yours. An unfinished life is not a failed life. It is just a life, moving the way all lives move, which is forward and sideways and sometimes backward, and always imprecisely. The people who seem most fully alive are not the ones who have arrived somewhere. They are the ones who have learned to be present inside the movement itself. Presence is not a destination, it is a practice. And like all practices, it is measured not in perfection, but in the sincere and repeated attempt. Every time you notice you have drifted and you choose to return, that is the practice working, not the practice failing. And slowly, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly and honestly, the present begins to feel less like something to endure and more like somewhere to actually be. The horizon does not disappear. Your dreams, your hopes, your sense of where you are going do not have to be given up. But the horizon becomes something you walk toward rather than something you escape to. And that difference changes the entire experience of moving through your own life. You are allowed to want more. Wanting more is not the problem. The problem was only ever that wanting more had replaced experiencing what is already here. The ordinary life, lived with genuine attention, turns out to contain more than the imagined life ever could, because the imagined life is always missing one thing. The one thing the imagined life is always missing is you, actually in it, actually feeling it, actually here. Your presence is not a small thing. It is the only thing that turns any moment, however ordinary, into an experience that actually belongs to you. So if you have spent years feeling like you were waiting for your real life to begin, this is the moment to consider that it already has. Not when the circumstances improve, not when the anxiety settles, not when you finally feel like the version of yourself you have been rehearsing. Now, with whatever is actually present, whatever is actually true, whatever is actually yours right now in this specific and unrepeatable moment. The waiting served you once. It kept you safe, it kept you moving, it kept hope alive in the only way it knew how. And you can thank it for that, genuinely, without irony, before choosing to step forward without it today. The suitcase by the door can be unpacked, slowly, at whatever pace feels honest, because you are not leaving for somewhere better anymore. You are already somewhere, and that somewhere, with your full attention on it, has more in it than you have yet allowed yourself to see. The conversation you keep meaning to have it. The thing you keep saving for later, do it now, or soon, or at least decide that it matters enough to schedule. The project that lives in a folder called Someday? Open the folder. Not to finish it, just to remember that it is yours, and it is real, and it deserves some of your actual present attention. The relationship that is already good enough to deserve your full presence? Give it that. Not the distracted version, the version that is always half somewhere else. None of this requires a dramatic change. It only requires a shift in where you place your attention, and the willingness to place it here, repeatedly, without demanding that here be perfect before it deserves your presence. If this video found you at a moment when the waiting feels particularly heavy, I hope it offered something small but real. Not a solution, just a recognition. The recognition that what you have been feeling is real and understandable and shared by far more people than you might imagine. The waiting is not a flaw. It is a very human response to a world that can feel uncertain, to a self that has not always felt safe enough to fully land. And landing, really landing, right here, right now, in the life that is already happening, is one of the quietest and most meaningful things a person can choose to do. Thank you for spending this time here. And if something in this video stayed with you, that is already your presence working, already you being here, already the beginning of something real. If this video stayed with you, if even one moment felt like something you already knew but had never heard said out loud, a like or a comment is a small way of telling us that this kind of content is worth continuing to make. And if you know someone who has been living a little beside their own life, someone who is always almost there, feel free to send this their way. Sometimes the right thing arrives at exactly the right moment.